The results, we got almost all of them right. Not really. We were actually catastrophically wrong with most of them because it was so lopsided. The results were crazy up and down. But let's start with one where I actually got the result right, and I think it was the only one this weekend. Union Berlin against, Dortmund against Union Berlin. One of the two top 4 fixtures that we had this weekend. And Stefan, you watched this game, so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, it was a really interesting match. Obviously, going into the game, there was so much that Dortmund kind of had to get right, obviously off the back of two, not just, disappointing results against Bayern and Leipzig, but two really soul-crushing performances. I thought, maybe I've been harsh, but that's certainly how I felt. I thought Bayern and Leipzig really had Dortmund's number in both of those games. They really brought them down a peg or two. And I think this clash could have really felt like, a moment which could have seen Dortmund's season crumble before our eyes. Terzic actually said before the game that it reminded him of the moment they had just before the World Cup where they lost to, I think, Gladbach and Wolfsburg. And basically everyone was really down on Dortmund, saying, they're a mess, gone through another chaotic season, Terzic isn't going to work. Back to the drawing board, and then obviously they came back after the World Cup and hit the ground running really well, all guns blazing, and really what's the word I'm looking for here? Pushed themselves into a title race, which is where we are now. And I felt like this game was a really good example of why Dortmund are where they are in the league table. Union Berlin, I think if you looked at that result, and maybe even if you watched the highlights on the YouTube channels, it would have looked like a very close match. Maybe it was in terms of XG, the stats. I haven't actually looked yet, but my impression watching the game was that Dortmund were actually pretty impressive for the most part. They created quite a lot of chances. They maybe even had a penalty at one point. And I think what was really encouraging for Dortmund was for a start, Daniel Malin scored a great goal. And he continues to slowly but surely rebuild the reputation at the club. We've seen this different side of him in the second half of the season. He's got his head down. He's working really hard. He comes across in the pitch now to me as this really hard-working, dynamic forward. He's not really as technically gifted as some other players. Certainly not really. He's not like a speed demon like Adeyemi or Bayern Gittins or even like a Marco Reus or something like that. But he does have a ruggedness to him that I think actually works quite well at times. He's quite happy to get stuck in. And that was the case with the goal in the first half, where a lovely little turn in between two Union players, and then he managed to really get himself into that back post position. And I don't know, it just I felt like, there's a really good moment in which, obviously, Sebastian Haller had a chance where he could have scored the back post. I can't remember if it was the first half or early in the second half. And then, of course, Moukoko came on. But I do feel like we've been talking about Haller for a couple of weeks now, in the sense that, he doesn't look quite 100%, obviously, which is by no means his fault. We do have to keep prefixing that, because we really don't want to come across as criticising him. But Dortmund need a goal scorer, and I think Terzic would have not only been delighted by the fact that they managed to pick up 3 points in this really crucial game, but the manner in which they scored both their goals. The first one came from Daniel Malin, who's this now backup player who's been working his socks off. Adeyemi actually played very well as well, but then Moukoko comes on and scores the winner, which was just a sheer stroke of luck, to be perfectly honest with you. If anyone wants to go look at the highlights, they'll know what I mean by that, which was Marco Reus got himself stuck in a cul-de-sac of defenders in front of the Union box, and then an interception happens to fall in the way of Moukoko, who scored a really great goal, really important goal. And all of a sudden Dortmund are back on track, and this is what we've I guess this is where Dortmund are right now. We've talked about this, they're very good at picking up points against teams who are below them in the league, and obviously Union Berlin are a very good team, but they are technically below Dortmund, and Dortmund would be expected to beat them at home. I don't know, I felt myself, and we'll talk about Bayern in a couple of minutes, so I guess this point really comes to that, but I did feel myself by the end of this match week thinking, that Der Klassiker didn't really change anything. Dortmund kind of slotted back into the team they are. Bayern, to the extent of kind of slotted back into the team they were before sacking Nagelsmann. But yeah, in terms of Dortmund, big result for them. And yeah, I don't know, what did you think of the game?
Yeah, no, and you mentioned the stats. I have them actually right in front of me here, Stefan. The XG was 2.59 to 0.46. This is via Bundesliga.com, right? They use AWS. I think there's also some other models that can be used, like Flash Score is another one. I think vScout has one as well. So take them with a grain of salt, because everyone seems to come up with a different XG. But if you go by this, I think that tells you quite a lot about the story, doesn't it? This could also have been like a 3-1 game quite easily, or like even maybe a 3-0. So it was a really good performance by Borussia Dortmund. And I think it's a performance that they probably needed to. You look at the responses after the match, whether it was Edin Terzic, Yusufa Moukoko, of course, comes on and scores the winner, right? Which is crucial, I think, for them, because they need to have him fit for this run and for actually to have a chance to maybe take the title away from Bayern Munich, who, in many ways do still seem wobbly at times. We're gonna get to talk about them in a moment, but I just thought the responses after this game were really interesting. I didn't watch this game live, I only watched the highlights, but what I did watch, and I always do this, and when the match day ends, I sort of go through the reactions, and it just seems to be a huge sense of relief in Dortmund at the moment, Stefan.
Yeah, because, as we kind of said, this result could have quite easily gone the other way. Well, maybe not the result, because I thought Dortmund played particularly well, but going into the game, we could have quite easily foreseen Union Berlin, at the very least, taking points off Dortmund, and all of a sudden, they're too far behind Bayern, and, all that kind of intrigue and all that sort of, delight that Dortmund were in a title race kind of fizzles out. And I think they're actually now in a pretty interesting position. I think, if I'm not mistaken, 4 of the last 7 games this season are now at home. And they do have a pretty formidable home record. So, I think it would be a really bizarre situation, and we'd have to kind of really dig into the history books to find the last example of this. But I do wonder when the last time Dortmund potentially won a league title without actually beating Bayern in the regular season or in the league itself, because if you think back to those Jurgen Klopp seasons, the thing that they were obviously very good at is that they had Bayern's number. They really had Bayern running scared. Eventually Bayern kind of managed to overcome that and kind of reclaim the kind of control of the league, but for a good 2 or 3 seasons, the reason that Dortmund were able to win those titles is because they were able to go toe-to-toe with Bayern. But we now find ourselves in a situation, potentially, whereby, Dortmund could arguably still kind of make up the difference with Bayern by going on and beating the rest of the teams that they're expected to beat. Bayern could potentially drop points, and Dortmund could end up lifting the league title, having, lost to Bayern they lost to the first that game, and then they drew obviously early in the season, if I'm not mistaken. But that'd be a very bizarre situation. Of course, I doubt Dortmund fans would really care. They'd be happy to win the league title whichever way they could. But yeah, that's the kind of scenario we find ourselves in, which by no means is a bad thing if you're obviously a Bundesliga fan looking for some kind of last end of season drama.
So I'm looking this up, and I think it was 2001-2002 that they won the Bundesliga title, and they lost to Bayern Munich in the Allianz, and they drew Bayern Munich at home, and they still ended up winning the title. And they snatched the title away from Bayer Leverkusen on the very last match day. That was, of course, when Leverkusen finished second in the Bundesliga, second in the Pokal, second in the Champions League, and to make matters worse for poor Michael Ballack, he then also finished second in the World Cup. But yeah, you have to go that far back.